Hello, hello. Hi, sorry. Ba 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 da ba. Yeah, we're good. Hi, I'm Sandy Toxvig, and inexplicably I'm hosting this thing. Um, and the panel are not who I thought they were going to be. So it's going to be it's going to be just great. Where's my wonderful wife? I give her my phone. So it doesn't. Oh, there she's at the back there. Could you see the nicest, prettiest woman at the back? Could you pass her that? It's totally going to be in there tonight. Now, welcome to the inaugural, I think, isn't it? It's the inaugural Primadonna. This is very exciting. Who's camping? How many people are camping? I'm in show business. I can't get enough camping. I think it's a fantastic thing. Right. So I think we're talking about men writing women. Please tell me that is what.
We are.
But all of my life is divided into little packets of what I'm doing next, and this is the one I picked up. So if we're not supposed to be talking about that, we are now. That is what we are going to be talking about. So men writing about women, not the worst thing men have done, I think, to women. I think we're. I've just been to the. Can I just put this off my chest? I've just been to the toilets, right? What is that about? What is that about? There's the same number of toilets for the boys, except there isn't. The boys' toilets were completely empty, so I went in, and there are 3 urinals and 2 loos. They've got 5 opportunities to wee, where we have 2, and they takes them 2 seconds. Anyway, I rather shocked a boy by going in there, so there's. Okay, so we're going to talk about men writing women. I don't know if you saw the Twitter challenge. There was a challenge on Twitter for women to describe themselves in the way a male author would. And the novelist Jennifer Weiner, she wrote, her breasts entered the room before her, far less interesting face. Her decidedly maternal hips and rounded thighs. He found her voice unpleasantly audible. As his gaze dropped from her mouth, still talking, to her cleavage, he wondered why feminists were so angry all the time. Hello. Never take an older woman from below the chin. I'm just going to say it to you now. Literally make me look shit. Are there any children? There's no children. Are there children? No, shit's a perfectly normal thing. Oh, my God. Anybody who likes words, I was so pleased with this yesterday. I was in Ipswich last night. We're trying to get rid of some dog poo. You know how it is? You've got a dog, it's late at night, you don't know where to put the dog poo. It's in a bag. And I walked along, and I was on Coprolite Street. Now, this only is funny if you... Coprolite is an old word for poo. Here's... Catherine's horrified that she's asked me to do this. Look at your face. This is also the Twitter challenge from writer Maria Devana Headley. Her body was an hourglass meant for taking his time. But her mohawk concerned him. She had a lesbian look and too many tattoos in languages he couldn't pronounce. Still, she'd written a stack of books. It was time for him to weigh in with his high school knowledge of Beowulf. That's fantastic, isn't it? Bloody love that. Okay, so I'll introduce the ones of the panel that I was ready for. And then the one on the panel I wasn't ready for, who I had really specific questions. We'll sort it out between us, because we're women. We can do talking. So Luke, hand up, Luke. This is Luke. Luke trained as a dancer at the Rambert School. That's lovely. Were you proper ballet dancer? Yes, I was. Were you? How do you feel my ballet career was cut short, Luke? We could discuss this later. Yet to give my Coppelia. He was until recently a dance critic for The Observer. He's written for Vanity Fair and The New Yorker. He's also a Booker Prize-nominated novelist. Lots of his novels feature women characters, most notably Eve and... Is it Villanelle? For the 4 novellas he wrote, which were adapted for television, the critically acclaimed BAFTA award-winning series Killing Eve. Who's seen Killing Eve? Go, Luke. That's a tick for you there, Luke. Michael, how do you say your last name? Donkor, loving it. Michael is a teacher and an author. He's been described as a powerful new British literary voice. Wow, that's like the kiss of death, Michael. Don't... I'm always described as still here. Selected by The Observer as a new face of fiction. His novel Hold follows the stories of 3 teenage girls from Ghana to Brixton. Is that right? Have I got that right? Good. This is actually a friend of mine. This is Dr. Naomi Paxton. She's a performer. She's a writer, researcher. You have a really diverse career, don't you? Yeah, a portfolio. Focused on the portrayal of women. If you've never seen her doing Ada Camp, her what do I say, cabaret character? I literally, a little bit of wee comes out every time I see it. It's Fantastic. That's okay. That's a compliment. You put that on your poster. A little bit of wee comes out. Sandy Toksvig. I think you're good. Older women will know what I'm talking about here. Go out without your tenor lady, trouble ahead. But in her doctor role, she's done extensive academic research into feminism, activism, and performance. Now, I was expecting Kit Duvall, but you are even better, like
Adele
way
Parks.
better. Adele Parks. Adele is also a novelist. I mean, a serious novelist. How many books? Like
19 novels in 19 years.
9. Wow, you're like the woo. It's like being in the room with Barbara Cartland.
Less pink.
Less pink.
Yeah.
Yeah, and no irritating dog. I'm going to sit down now, as I feel I did my. Okay. What kind of? Start with you, because I don't know, literally know nothing about you.
Okay, here we go.
What kind of
What do you
novels?
want? All sorts of novels, different genres. So I've written I'm currently writing domestic noir. New one coming out this week. Got a little exclusive. It's here called Lies, Lies, Lies. It's about family in disarray. It is written from a male and female point of view. So
Okay.
suddenly when Kit got, I don't know, ill or something.
Oh no, don't make us
You
feel bad
can
about Kit. We don't even know
talk
Kit.
I know Kit, she's lovely.
Is she good?
So yeah, there we go. I was hanging around. I thought put her in.
Well, just explain to me domestic noir. What is we saying? What is that?
Somebody might die and they'll probably have been killed by somebody they know. Just so it's the horror in your home.
I feel a musical coming on. Fantastic. Okay, so the question if we are asking, is it possible for a man to write a good woman character? So I'm going to start with you, Michael. You are 34. This is not like a dating thing. Suddenly it feels like blind date, doesn't it? Is that yeah. Maybe not. So you wrote a coming of age novel, Hold. So you've written about 3 teenage girls. Yes. So where did you think, how am I going to get into their mindset?
Do you know what? I didn't worry about the kind of question of writing female characters at all, which maybe is a slightly kind of problematic thing to say, but I'm pleased that I kind of entered into it just thinking I want to write about these characters and individuals rather than thinking, oh gosh, I've got to get the kind of girl stuff right, because I think that would have led me to shoehorn in all sorts of stereotypical girly stuff. Sort of like I had a checklist of things that clearly identified my characters as female. And instead I just thought, okay, well, what interests these characters, what motivates them, what terrifies them, and those sorts of questions kind of led me through their kind of development rather than thinking, oh shit, I'm not allowed to do this. This is not my terrain.
And do you have may I ask if you have a Ghanaian connection?
I do. So I'm Ghanaian. I'm British Ghanaian. So.
And is the experience of a girl growing up in Ghana very different to the experience of a boy growing up? Would you say?
Yes, I would actually. I think even though great strides are being made in Ghana in terms of gender equality, I think it's still a massively patriarchal society. And, you know, speaking from my own experience, when we go back to Ghana, I've got 2 sisters. They're older than me and they're very accomplished and wonderful. But when we kind of visit relatives, the focus is very much on the boy. What is the boy? Oh, the boy. And my 2 sisters very patiently and begrudgingly kind of wait until attention is turned to them, which lasts for about 2 seconds, and then swiftly return back to the boy. So.
And what's that about? Is that about the boy is the one who's going to look after the older relatives, or what is the sense of that?
I think there's still that kind of idea that having a male child is a sort of prized thing, and you know, having a daughter is wonderful, but it's not as good as having a boy who will be able to do these wonderful things for the family.
I see.
And spread the family name here, there, and everywhere, and kind of lift up the reputation of the family. So I think that's sort of what's kind of behind that tendency.
So now Michael's saying that he didn't really want to worry about the kind of girly thing. So you say you've written as well from a male perspective. Do you worry about thinking, oh, I better make sure like he touches his crotch 3 times because I've done like a boy thing?
And and it's interesting because I read Michael's book. Is this working? I don't like things this close to my mouth. Well, not
that's a completely different session.
Anyway, so I was just going to say I read Michael's book and I read it without looking at who'd written it, and I actually thought a woman had written it, which is a good and a bad thing because you shouldn't judge one way or the other, but it means you really pulled off being a girl. Well done. So no, it's never crossed my mind to care when I write as a man, but I don't. There are no children, right? Okay, so I don't write specifically about like I wouldn't try and write a male having sex. I don't know what it feels like to be a man having sex, but I can do pretty much anything else because I don't think the gaps are as big as we always like to think. I think there are things that we have in common, like, you know, arms and legs and heads, and thoughts and feelings. And so I think there's enough to be able to write things that I am not. I mean, I set my books, sometimes I do historical novels, and I will set those in times I've never lived in. It's called having an imagination, and it's fine.
Well, there's an interesting quote. Kate Blanchett, the wonderful Australian actress, she recently said, "I will fight to the death for the right to suspend disbelief and play roles beyond my experience." And I think that's an interesting thing that artists in whatever genre, they portray different people. So, Naomi, your alter ego, Ada Camp, I mean, she is literally nothing like you at all. Isn't that the point of being artists? Isn't it the point that we imagine and we try and embody things that maybe are beyond our own experience?
Yeah, I think so. I think often or certainly when I was training to be an actor, I thought very much it was about not being me, about putting layers on. I think the more experience you get performing professionally, the more you realise it's about taking layers off. And even though I dress up a lot as Ada, in a way it just releases me to be a different sort of me. People relate to me very differently when I'm dressed as Ada Camp, and I love that. It's a glimpse into a whole different way of being, and that's such a treat. And The Artifice is kind of a double bluff then to release another part of your personality.
I mean, if you haven't seen it, it's the only double act in the world with a rubber chicken. I've never. It's
Duck.
sorry, I meant duck. I got
Chicken would be stupid.
That's right. I feel like an idiot now. So what we're trying to establish is that you can use your imagination. So Luke, the Killing Eve stuff. How much do you know about killing? I mean, did you know a lot about killing beforehand?
Well, it's a mechanical process.
Hold it really close here, Luke. Hold it up close. That's it. There you go.
It is a mechanical process. It has stages and can be analysed. When I was writing about Eve and Villanelle, essentially, I didn't want to stop and describe them. I just wanted to say the things that they did. They're both professional women who are working in complicated circumstances. So I felt that rather than, exactly as Michael said, rather than thinking, well, I have to get the female specific stuff right, actually these are just two working people in slightly different careers, but who define themselves by the things that they do.
But why did you choose to make them women? Why could have been?
Well, I thought, why not? To be honest, because I like thrillers, and I'd read a lot of thrillers, and I had got increasingly bored with the cardboard male figures, very, very tech-obsessed, very, very shallowly drawn with their complexes and their broken marriages and their love of jazz and
that is a weird thing, that love of jazz thing.
They all have it.
Yeah.
Sooner or later, they will all sit down at a piano and start picking out a jazz standard. It's just a thing. If you're, so I just didn't want anybody to be good at jazz.
It's perfectly reasonable. I have to say, women in crime, not always realistically presented. Stuart Woods is a New York Times best-selling American novelist. So in 2018, he wrote a novel called Desperate Measures. This is a quote from it. It's a quote from Dino, who is a New York cop. It's a quote about him. Dino put his feet up and chatted for a couple of minutes. Then he put the phone down and returned to the table. Okay, he said, the ME confirms his first estimate of time of death. The girl had a tiny purse tucked into her vagina, just big enough to hold her driver's license, a credit card, and a few bucks. Anybody? Oh my God, Stuart, where have you been looking for these? Yes, I use my vagina instead of a purse. It's a fantastic thing. One of the things that is much debated these days, we talk a lot about cultural appropriation. That is the thing. Scarlett Johansson, she was famously cast as, and then she pulled out of playing a trans character because there was a sort of backlash to the fact that she was not trans. And I wonder whether the whole topic of cultural appropriation is something that you think is appropriate to talk about. Is it appropriate to talk about in terms of men writing about women? Usually we're talking about somebody from a dominant culture, culturally appropriating something from a minority. Here, the majority are being appropriated from. So I wonder if it's even something that we should be talking about. Does anybody have a view?
I think it is a really relevant question. It's a very thorny one because I think it's really legitimate for lots of female writers, women writers, to be kind of concerned by the idea that men are sort of writing these stories about female experience if that means that female voices are not being heard. So I think that's one real element to kind of bear in mind. But I suppose the thing that I think's also worth thinking about is that there's something really important and useful about men imagining female experience. If we're trying to get men who are kind of backwards in their thoughts about the world in all sorts of ways to kind of move their thinking on, part of that process might be enabled by them imagining themselves into experiences beyond themselves. So sort of requiring men to just write about male experience and women to do the same actually might do a disservice to everyone. So whilst I'm really, really conscious of the fact that women should have ultimate authority over their stories, I think in order to get men to learn more about themselves and about female experience, it might require men thinking more about writing women's voices and women's worlds.
I mean, Luke, you're nodding along there. Do you agree? You agree with Michael?
Well, I do agree. I mean, I think we should all write about each other and try and do it as well as we can. I don't think anything or anyone should be off limits to anyone. But having said that, there are responsibilities involved to get it right and to do the work and to talk to the people and that we should all represent each other as broadly and as fairly and as accurately as we can.
Adele, do you want?
I'd be so irritated if I was told I couldn't write men. So I presume you'd be very irritated if you were told you couldn't write women. I mean, I would probably stop writing if I was told that, and I would go and campaign for civil rights to be allowed to talk about what I want to talk about. Because I think being able to imagine myself as a man or imagine my character as a man is absolutely essential. I think there is a very different conversation to be had that, again, acting, you know, I thought that was a shame that she pulled out of that role. I thought it was ridiculous. I thought she should have done her best. She was a fabulous actress and she would have, you know, done a really good job. And I'd rather that story told than not told. So,
Naomi, do you agree?
I don't know the exact circumstances of that. I suppose the thing I'm thinking about, so my academic research is on the professional theatre wing of the suffrage movement, which was supported by women and men who wrote plays and wrote very interesting plays about diverse lived experiences, including women who presented as men, women who identified in different ways through their lived experience, even if they weren't articulated in that way. And I think there was something around not just understanding a visual representation of a culture and then going with the stereotypes that accompany that. So, for example, all these stereotypes you can imagine of suffragettes, for example, or suffragists, but actually a lived experience of campaigning, a lived experience of the labour of what has traditionally been women's domestic lives or women's working lives, and then coming at that. So imagining oneself into that position through that lived experience of working with and alongside women in different kind of jobs and professions or even in the home. So therefore, it's not a problem that they write women because they have an experience of that part of life. They haven't just gone on the visual kind of the dominant representations in society or in the literature and the culture.
I mean, I think there's a problem for the modern way in which writers are viewed, because writers now have social media and writers are on magazines and television and so on, that there's a sort of presumption that the writer always brings something of themselves and their own experience to the thing that they write. I wrote a play with two men with PTSD, and a reviewer wrote that one of the men was gay. It literally wasn't anywhere in the play, but because I am, he made the presumption that the character must be. Do you think that is a problem that we decide?
I think it is, because we always say, oh, write what you know. Well, I've written 19 novels. I don't know that much. I have not lived that much. Honestly, husband's in the room. Honestly. No, I haven't. And so, you know, you've got to go to other places. And I think it was going back to your point that you need to research as well. And there's a responsibility of talking about subjects that you have gone and looked at in depth. So, I don't know, I've had characters in prison. I've never been in prison. But I did do small things to kind of put myself in that situation where I wouldn't allow myself to go to the loo when I wanted to. I had to wait, because you give them permission of when you can go to the loo or whatever, or you go to the loo in front of someone. And I did little things and put myself in a smaller room and wouldn't let myself out of the room, and I didn't go outside for a few days to start giving myself a feeling to help with my research. But I didn't go and commit a crime so I could go to prison so I could write the book, because that's silly.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, I think we should give ourselves permission to write about things we don't know, as long as we go and research and be as authentic as we can be.
I was going to say, I think it's also about being aware, as much as you can be, about your unconscious biases or what they're likely to be, given your privilege, and thinking, well, I don't necessarily, if I might make this character somebody who I think is like me, that doesn't need to be the case. I don't need to be specific about this character's gender, this character's ethnicity, this character's class background, even this character's accent. I can write a character or be in communion with characters that are very different from me, and I don't have to be explicit, and therefore I can make them as open as possible so that the audience members can make those points of connection that they want to, and they're not actively excluded. I think it's about kind of not actively excluding rather than trying to be constantly inclusive, because we're bound to miss because of that unconscious bias, because that privilege that we're not aware of. I think it's about trying to open up those threads and say, actually, there are points of connection here, and I don't have to nail everything down. I can make it authentic, I can make it relatable, but also I can make that about the feelings, about the emotions, the thoughts, not necessarily about the race, the gender, the ethnicity, the age.
So we're all for all we've got in common, we're also very different. So when I came across Eve and Villanelle, I didn't think they're women like me, because they're not. But I just thought, God, I want to be their friend, because they were such good women. You know, I wanted them to exist. I wanted to meet them, but I didn't think, oh, they're like me, because I meet lots of women that are not like me. That's great. You know, it would be really boring and exhausting if you were all like me. So you know, that's actually also diversity in amongst, you know, other white 50-year-old women are not going to be like me, because we're just not all the same.
But Luke, did you have to spend time thinking, oh, well, if there was this situation, clearly she's not going to sit down and play the piano, so what is she going to do at this point?
Well, yes, I researched very closely, for example, Eve's job. The job that she had at MI5 exists. It is a precise post with a numbered office, and I also researched a female assassin who was a hit woman for ETA, whose modus operandi was to lure policemen for sex and then to kill them. And she did this, I think, about 29 times. And she was quite spectacular looking. You can see how a nervous young policeman might find her alluring. And then, having done it 29 times, she was put in prison and rolled straight over. And so, you know, very peculiar.
Sorry, wait a minute. This is a technical term. She rolled straight over. I was still thinking about her having sex with all those people.
No, she
was a sneak. She was a grass.
She became a witness for the prosecution of other people in return for her kind of 1,000-year sentence being reduced to 900 or something like that. But
wow.
But she's not gaining anything there, and she could have been successful in whatever she did. So
well, clearly, 29 times. I mean, I can't get my children to stick to anything.
So the character of Villanelle is not impossible, and in today's Russia, people do kill for cash, and not a great deal of cash. So putting all these things together and working out how somebody who was really good at it would do it, and how they would be trained, it's a process. And exactly as Adele says, you have to put in your work. And from the work and from the research and from the facts, the characters emerge. And I think there's a misunderstanding of how fiction writers create characters. The idea that it's a kind of A plus B equation. I know somebody like that. There's a bit of me. It's a much more convoluted process, a much longer process, and it comes from much odder places than that.
Well, it's interesting when a lot of actors, when they're developing a new character, they often talk about starting with the shoes. You start with the shoes, and the reason you do that is because you need to get the walk of this person. I wonder, Michael, when you're doing 3 teenage girls, whether you had to think about what they might be wearing, how they might prepare themselves to go out into the world.
It's really interesting thinking about, Villanelle and even about their work being the thing that defines them rather than their gender, because I think similarly that's how I kind of approached my characters. I thought about the fact that Belinda is a housemaid. And so actually, rather than focusing on, oh gosh, I've got to get the girl stuff right, I thought about cleaning an awful lot and the kind of technicalities of cleaning and what cleaning meant to her. And of course, cleaning and women cleaning is a hugely gendered issue, but that wasn't what Belinda was thinking about in the moment when she was washing the dishes. We bring all of that stuff to it when we're reading it, and it's there in the back of my head when I'm writing. But I was so much more interested in, okay, so she's in this kitchen. How tall is she? What does that mean in terms of where she has to stand to get the glasses from that cabinet? Okay, what does she think about the tiles over there? How difficult does she find it to kind of keep those as shiny as they need to be kept? How does she fold bed sheets? It was that kind of stuff that I was kind of focusing on, and her attitudes towards the task that she had to fulfill told me things about who she was. So thinking about the stuff kind of that they do in their life, that characters do in their lives, what they're actually engaged in, is much more revealing about who they are, rather than going at it the other way around, as in thinking, gosh, she's a teenage girl, let's make her cleaning reflect teenagedom and girlhood. That would be foolish, I think.
Well, the thing about reflecting everyday life, there's a great bit from Dickens, David Copperfield, and it goes, I playfully tried verbal instructions in domestic matters. For example, when we passed a butcher's shop, I would say, now suppose, my pet, that we were married, and you were going to buy a shoulder of mutton for dinner. Would you know how to buy it? My pretty little Dora's face would fall, and she would make her mouth into a bud again, as if she would very much prefer to shut mine with a kiss. This is a young woman baffled by the purchase of lamb. It is a everyday story of women's hell in the world. So the real question is how we are culturally sensitive, how we make sure that we're being sensitive to the fact that we're writing something which is not of our experience. I don't know if you saw recently, a group of Jewish actors have recently written an open letters, a production of Falsettos, which is an American musical, and nobody in the company is Jewish. It is a Jewish story, and this is very upsetting. And I think cultural sensitivity is an issue. Luke, I would ask you. There's a very strange thing, it seems to me, that if there are female assassins and they're rather clinical, they necessarily have to have lesbian sex. And I just wondered what it is about lesbians that make them so cold-blooded. I don't know what it is about. It just seems to be a thing to me that you think, oh, it's a serial killer, she'll be a lesbian in a minute.
In fact, she's bisexual.
I'm so sorry, but she does have to have lesbian sex. It's a thing. I don't know what it is it?
Well, she doesn't have to, but she does choose to.
Yeah, no, I meant if I'm watching it and I've no idea which way you're going to go in the bed department, I guarantee she's going to be a lesbian. For me, those are the things that, a lesbian, it irritates me. But I just wonder if you have to be culturally sensitive or it's okay.
Well, the books and the TV series are subtly different in that respect. And the sex that they have, that she has in both, is different. I mean, my approach to her sexuality is that it's just, as far as she's concerned, pretty much an amenity that she reaches for when she feels like it, and she moves on, and right. That's it, really. So it's, and it's sometimes men and it's sometimes women. In the TV series, she has different partners, and they tend to end up worse off, if not dead. So rather than simply being kicked out in the morning, which is or her just leaving. So it's do you have to be culturally sensitive? Yes, but I was really guided by how this character would behave.
Right. So she's treating it more like playing tennis, the sex thing. Yeah. No, I get that. I understand that. She's a woman of appetites, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's one more consumable amenity that she earns a great deal of money, and she has a limited amount of ways of spending this. So and clothes is one of them. But she dresses, and clothes were a very important thing when we were talking about the series, because clothes define her, but only because the clothes that she wears are for herself, completely for herself. They're not intended to attract anyone. So again, she is in this blinkered world of her own, pleasing only herself, and those are the rules for her. She's not thoughtful of other people's experience.
No, I completely get that books and television don't necessarily. You know, there's a thing called dead lesbian syndrome. Do you know about this? Dead lesbian syndrome. If you see a lesbian in a television thing and you think, and one person's going to die, it will be her. It will be. There's just a thing. But I'll move on. Adele, what do you think about cultural sensitivity? Do you think there's an issue both ways that you have
with
to
genders?
Yeah,
or
with gender.
I don't give them much thought for men. That's honest, isn't it? No, I think God, they've had so many advantages. Suck it up a bit if they're a bit offended by anything I write. No, I don't. I just okay. So if I've got domestic violence, so a book and it might have domestic violence in, that can happen both ways, but largely statistically, it's a man assaulting a woman. So I think, largely statistically, I am more likely to write about a man assaulting a woman. It's not impossible. I would write about a woman assaulting a man, but if I was doing it that way around, I know that I would talk to victims of domestic violence. I don't think I would spend too much time talking to, because I do a lot of talking to people that have gone through anything I'm about to write about, because it's a very good way.
You wouldn't talk to the perpetrators?
I didn't. I'm just thinking about it now and thinking, when I did it, did I? But then I knew one. So I think I knew somebody well enough to think, well, I could use that anyhow. So I was using it without actually having the conversation. But I suppose if we took it to the extreme, what are domestically violent men's rights? Not sure I care. Isn't that really wrong of me and really politically incorrect? But there you go. I'm not sure I do care. So I didn't spend too much time thinking about that side of it. I would, because the story I'm telling is the woman's story in that particular case.
Although it is possible that the perpetrator's story is more nuanced than we have
and
understood.
Actually, I do give nuance, because it is always nuanced, and there is usually a reason. And maybe there was violence in their childhood, or nobody just does that because they feel like it. But that wasn't the story I was telling. But now you're making me think that that's the next story I should tell. And then
that's what I love about these panels. We all go away going, I'm going to write a completely different book
I'm
now.
going to write something different. But if I'm really honest, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the differences between men and women. I spend a lot more time thinking about the similarities. And I obviously am a woman, and I have a lot more experience about being a woman. But I have a son, and I've had husbands, and
how many?
Several.
Just
9. They're all dead. I need to get my inspiration from somewhere. No. Do you know what I mean? So I think there is enough that I have male friends, I have female friends. I don't spend a lot of time thinking, right, I don't know how to talk to you. You're a different gender to me. I just start talking to people, and I think maybe that works.
And Michael, you must presumably feel the same, because you have. You said you have sisters, is that right?
Yeah, I do. But thinking specifically about cultural sensitivity, I think in theory it's always really important for us to be culturally sensitive, and when we're taking a story that isn't immediately our own, to just acknowledge that in some way. But equally, just as you were talking, I was thinking about the actual process of writing, and I think when you're writing a first draft, actually nothing should be off limits at all. You should be able to write about male experience if you're a woman, or trans experience if you're not trans, or experience of being white if you're black, or whatever. Write what your imagination is leading you to write. I think then once you've got that sort of solid bit of work and you can distance yourself from it, then there might be some thoughts about sensitivity and am I able to tell the story? Am I telling it authentically or accurately? But I think in the first instance you should be able to write what you want to write. We shouldn't police our creativity. I think that leads to all sorts of dangerous outcomes. But I think it's after we've kind of done the initial work, then we might be able to be a bit more reflective about what it is you've got in front of you.
I think that's just absolutely right, that you should always be open. But I do think that there is something to be said about a different race. I mean, that is more sensitive. And I don't know why it's more sensitive. Just being really honest, I don't know why it's more sensitive, and yet it obviously is. I would feel that if I was, and I have, written as characters of different race, I would definitely check that. The way, to be fair, if I'm writing a teenager, I would definitely check that because it's been a while. And I would just make sure, that. But I just would never want to offend. Where if I'm honest, going back to that thing of going kind of gender, I'm going, well, I might offend a bit. As I say, suck it up. But I think there is something different there. How do you feel about that? Because obviously you're black, so you must have a different view on that too.
I agree with you. There is a sort of different feeling about that.
And I don't know if that's
context.
right or wrong of me to think that's different.
From my point of view, and this is a very complicated discussion, and everyone has their own takes on this, so I'm very happy to talk to people about it. But my feeling is that black people's voices have been so historically marginalised, abused, misrepresented, mistranslated, silenced, oppressed, etc. And we have a long, long way to go before that balance is redressed. So it feels strange for me to have a kind of white person saying, well, that's all fine now, we sorted it out, I can now take on your story again. Because we're not at that point yet. That's my feeling.
But the lines are difficult, are they? They're difficult to draw because the trans community feels very strongly.
Absolutely.
The LGBT community generally feels very strongly.
But he's absolutely, Michael, you're so spot on, because if you think about the history of the novel, that's kind of been one of the few things that has been it's very male dominated, but females did get in pretty early. And so, in fact, it was seen as quite an easy genre, so the women were handed it. But so maybe because
and
male
early
and
novels were kind of written for a female readership.
Yeah, so male and female voices got a little bit more equal telling, and you're absolutely right, you've put your finger on it, that I couldn't quite articulate myself, but transgender or races haven't had that equal billing for 200 years, so that is the difference.
Well, let's do a quote from somebody who's all about the women, Boris Johnson. Hey, nice segue. This is him writing about Winston Churchill. Churchill falls head over heels in love with Pamela Plowden and declares she's the most beautiful girl I've ever seen. He takes her on an elephant, does all the right things. It's hardly his fault if she turns him down, because he'd done all the right things by taking her on an elephant. I just want to talk a bit about the impact on material. Luke, you talked about the television series being different to the books, but there were 3 women lead writers. Is that correct? You've had 3 different women lead writing on the television series. Do you think that women coming in and taking over your stories and your characters had an impact on the writing?
On what I'm writing now in the novels?
Yeah. No. Do you think that the characters changed dramatically? Do you think that the way in which they behaved changed because women were now, as it were, genuinely coming up with the voices? You don't think so?
I don't think so, no. I think that the central relationship and the 2 central characters remain consistent through all the books and the TV series. And that's partly because we've got actors who are so good at what they do, who absolutely inhabit those roles. And it could have gone terribly wrong with the wrong people, with the wrong people in those roles.
But so having a woman writer writing the story made no difference, as it were, appreciable difference.
No, I mean,
that's interesting.
I felt when the title was optioned first, I was asked if I had any preferences about screenwriters, and I said, well, I do think that this would be a good series to be for the writers to be led by a woman on.
Why did you feel that?
I just felt that there's a tendency for TV thrillers to go in certain directions, and I really didn't want it to be procedural or any of those things. I wanted it to be very, very different. And I was given a list of possible writers, and on the top of that list was, I think one of the few women on the list was Phoebe Waller-Bridge. And I went to see her Fleabag, which had just been at Edinburgh, just opened in London. And it wasn't the content that made me feel that she was the right person to be in charge of it. It was the fact that she was completely fearless. And it was that fearlessness that I thought the series needed to absolutely drag it away from the conventional TV thrillers and the shape and colour and smell of them.
I'm trying to think of great characters in literature that I would love to see them rewritten, as it were, by a woman, whether it would make any difference. So there's a few Shakespearean. I'm a complete Shakespeare geek. I would love to see Cleopatra written from a woman's point of view. I'm doing a show at the moment at the Globe Theatre, writing it for the Globe Theatre, and we tried to find an example of good mothering in Shakespeare. Nothing. I mean, nothing. Just no. Everybody just fucked it up. It just. It's totally. Is there anybody that you would like to see? Is there anybody?
Well, I was just thinking about the Shakespeare thing because one of the things from my research is that the suffrage performers and campaigners and writers didn't do all-female Shakespeares. They made new work. They didn't try and shoehorn politics into existing material. They made new stuff. And I've actually spent more time than I ever would have thought when I first started doing this research championing the male suffrage campaigners, who particularly the male theatre writers, and partly because it's about visibility. Somehow, if I say, oh well, Barry and Shaw and Zangwill and Houseman, that makes people feel like, oh, it's not niche ghetto women stuff. But I'm actually about to make a radio documentary about suffrage Punch and Judy shows.
Oh, I love this.
Which is really interesting, a really interesting phenomenon, written by women but performed by militant men, so the Men's Political Union for Women's Enfranchisement. And thinking about that story, that traditional story of domestic violence and of death, and how you would harness that as a political tool to teach the children of suffragists as well as suffragists about how maybe stories could be different, about ideas of traditional relationships could be different. And maybe Punch, performed by male militant suffrage campaigners, is not punching across the playboard, but instead punching up at the authorities. And there's lots of interesting examples of. I've got a couple of edited collections of suffrage plays in the book, and I really try and include kind of male and female writers, because there are men who take the mick, and there are women who take the mick who are anti-suffragists. But male writers not only write men who are slightly maybe, I would say weaker. That sounds pejorative. In some cases, it is pejorative. But they are not adhering to the kind of traditional sort of domestic masculinity. They're hampered by different things, not by jazz or not by alcohol, but by insecurity, by fear, and hypocrisy. But they write women that harness the negative stereotypes that we imagine. A lot of them, often militant suffrage campaigners are portrayed with enormous breasts that are barely contained by their tweed blazers. Enormous brains and furrowed brows that are barely contained by their pork pie hats and
I
glasses.
totally want to play this
It's
person.
so good. It's so good. And their flat feet. And they're not offended by these offensive stereotypes. They go on the offensive with them and they harness them and go, yeah, look at it. Why is this so problematic? Why, when people are kind of... So if you are destined for motherhood but you have no children, what do anti-suffrage and suffrage campaigners imagine that you do with these physical appendages? How do you use these disused skills? To what purpose do you turn your genetic predisposition for organisation and caring and politics? And that's a really interesting thing. So I've ended up, I think, talking much more about pro-suffrage men and the characters they created.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, than I ever would have anticipated.
I love these big-breasted women. I think it's marvelous. Of course she became a suffragette. Her golf swing was impossible. Kept knocking herself out. Now, I had to take a bit of a quote from some sexist bastard. Norman Mailer, bless, An American Dream. And then I chose, but there was time to change. I chose her cunt. It was no graveyard now, no warehouse. No, more like a chapel, a modest, decent place. But its walls were snug, its odor was green. Anybody? There was a sweetness in the chapel, a muted, reverential sweetness in those walls of stone. So what is the impact? I know, I have a worse one from Ernest Hemingway, but I actually can't bring myself to say it out loud. It's absurd. Wow, really? Okay. You're just beating yourselves up. It's a bonus bit of sexual assault. It's a short story called Up in Michigan. She was very frightened and didn't know how he was going to go about things, but she snuggled close to him. Then the hand that felt so big in her lap went away and was on her leg and started to move up it. Don't, Jim, Liz said. Jim slid the hand further up. You mustn't, Jim, you mustn't. Neither Jim nor Jim's big hand paid any attention to her. I told you, I warned you. Tried to help you.
Can I offer a bit of masculine
Go.
writing? Now, this is not in the book. This is it's supposed to be a suffrage satire. It's written by a chap. It's a play called When Women Rule by an American chap called Ned Joyce Heaney. And it was done in 1913. It was set in 2013. And it features Florence, who's the mayor of whatever town she's in, and Patricia, who's a great political boss. And Florence is a woman about 32 or 25.
Same difference.
Same. Of good height, preferably brunette, inclined to be slender. She wears a man's collar and tie, also a man's vest, and a mannish cut black suit. She wears a divided plaid skirt. When we get down to Patricia, she's big and rather stout with a large bust. She wears a high silk hat, a frock coat, a divided skirt of a gay pattern, and a man's collar and tie. And these women stride about, smoking cigars and going to the club. And that's the only way that this chap can even imagine women in politics in the future. And I should be deeply offended. It's just brilliant.
It's
stuff.
fantastic. It's very like any meeting of the Women's Equality Party.
Yeah, exactly.
So just a general, because we're gonna run out of time. A general question. Well, I mean, it seems to me we have a responsibility not just in how we portray women, but how we portray everything that we're looking at. Is it? I mean, Adele, do you want any last thoughts?
Well, I think you just summed up completely correctly. We do have a responsibility, but we also responsibility probably is to ourselves first, because it's our words on a page. So if I want to challenge or offend or create, I guess that's me, and I have to take it on the chin, because you can't please all the people all the time, and that would be the worst thing to try to do as a writer. It would just be suicide.
Yeah, Lou?
Well, I think bad descriptions of women are two things. They're bad writing, but they're also bad thinking. And if I just can read, I'll spare you the whole thing, but I'll read the first sentence. Diane looked at herself in the mirror again, from her neatly trimmed pubic hair between rounded hips to her almond-shaped face and crown. Picture that, if you will.
That's always my gaze in the mirror. I just go and working my way up. That's always
It's that almond-shaped face.
everything about it, really. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank God her pubes hadn't been allowed to go wild.
Yes. Michael.
I think it's worth thinking about writers who do this whole thing well, who do it really brilliantly. So male writers who write female experience really movingly. And my sort of favourite example of that is Colm Tóibín. And I think he is someone who kind of demonstrates how, by writing from the inside, so writing about the characters' psychology and their emotional landscape, rather than thinking about what their boobs are doing or what their hips are doing or how lovely their pubic hair is. That's the way that you create real human characters, and he does it so consistently and so flawlessly. And most of his novels are about female experience, actually, and they all feel to me, and to my female friends who've read his writing, they feel really authentic and touching. So yeah, Colm Tóibín.
And Naomi, because you've done a lot of academic research, I'm going to presume that the way in which women are presented by other writers, this is it's a really important part of our journey as we still strive towards equality.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's about recognising that those stereotypes exist in every generation, every iteration of waves of feminism, that they're there to do a job, that they do that job very well, which is why they perpetuate. And that we shouldn't run from fear of them, we should acknowledge them. And if we learn anything from those previous generations, it's to harness, we're doing it now, the nasty woman, the pussy hat, same thing, same with suffragettes, is to harness those negative stereotypes and expose them for what they are. On a more serious note, I suppose it's about making sure there's a diversity of voices, that reaching the widest platforms as possible, and about not being afraid to ridicule some of those things. So we have that now, don't we, on Twitter, when people point out manels, for example, and sort of all male panels about women's experience, or all white panels about diversity and inclusion. So I think not being cowed by that dominant voice and instead exposing it to ridicule, because actually, if we can, that our shoulders go back, and it makes us. It makes us feel more confident in terms of going forward. It will always be a struggle. I think looking back just shows us that it's always a struggle, that these voices perpetuate, that there's no one person doing anything wrong, that it's systemic inequality and systemic oppression of different voices. And so the best thing we can do is try and own these and push them on through and try and use our powers for good.
Well, I think it must surely be lunchtime. I'm hungry. Thank you very much. This is the first festival. I think it's absolutely fantastic. Can I just say how lovely to sit on the grass and have a conversation, and then the writers are going to be around, and it's slightly weird. There's a person on a swing over there, and there's the Virgin Mary. It's a slightly odd... Honestly, never played anything quite like it. But thank you for coming and listening, and thank you to our fabulous panel.